Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's IamOnline, the monthly webinar focused on identity and access management. IamOnline is brought to you by Uncommon, Internet2, and the EDUCAUSE Higher Education Information Security Council. We'll be taking questions and comments during the Zoom, using the Zoom chat function, so please send those messages during the presentation. You'll find the chat button along the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you have to click the button to see the chat. My name is Kevin Maroney, and I work at Internet2. I'm the Vice President for Trust and Identity Things and Net Plus Things at Internet2. I'll be acting as both your moderator and host today. I'm joined by Justin Knight of JISC and Scott Cantor from Ohio State University. Justin is the manager in charge of the operator function in the Shibboleth Consortium, and Justin will explain his role a little bit more in a bit. And Scott, as many of you know, is and has been the lead developer for the Shibboleth project for many years now. And with that, I'll hand it over to Justin.
Thanks very much, Kevin, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. As Kevin mentioned, my role is the consortium manager. But I work for JISC. For anyone who's not familiar, JISC are the NREN in the UK. We run a number of services like the Janet Network, UK Access Management Federation, we're the EduRoam operator in the UK. And part of our role is also to manage the operations of the Shibboleth Consortium. I've been doing the role since about October 2014. And in that time, the challenges that we've seen in the consortium have been pretty consistent. From the consortium and the Shibboleth project's perspective, the software is open source, free for anyone to download and use, and we've got absolutely no desires or intentions to make a change to that. So our main challenge is being able to keep that free for anyone to use whilst meeting the costs associated with maintaining it. We've seen wide-scale adoption since Shibboleth was introduced back in 2001. It's very well adopted across the States, across Europe, and globally, and is also picking up some traction over in Asia Pacific as well now, as more identity federations are born and more institutions deploy identity provider and service provider software. We still see a growth in the use of Shibboleth, which is excellent. Obviously, with this, it means that we have a growing amount of time and effort to maintain the product, and that has a cost associated with it. And one of the other challenges is the area of Shibboleth development, support and maintenance does remain quite niche, and that commands a fair value. So this is where the consortium came in, and the consortium was founded in 2013. It's comprised of a board, and the main bulk of the consortium is its membership. We have a pool of developers, which now stands at 8. That's grown since the last time we did an IamOnline. The last time we did one of these, I think was May 2017, and we had 6 developers. We've been fortunate enough to bring 2 more people into the team, which I'm very pleased about. And the consortium's role is to handle all of the financial and contractual management. So we make sure that we have consistent accounts, a reserve fund available for any enhancements to the product, and making sure that the support and maintenance carries on. The consortium is also responsible for strategic direction to the Shibboleth project. So there is that distinction between the Shibboleth project and its roadmap, and that's what Scott's going to be talking about in quite some detail after me, and the consortium, which looks after the contractual and financial side of things. As it's not a legal entity in itself, the consortium requires an operator. As I mentioned, that's been JISC since 2013, and I've been in the role of manager since about 2014. So financially, we have 3 main things that we want to do. We want to ensure that the costs of maintaining the product and the operations of the consortium are consistently met. We want to make sure that we can maintain a reasonable reserve for specific enhancements and risk mitigation, for things like urgent bug fix. or bringing an additional developer effort where required. And we also want to be able to build a strong financial position to make sure that we continue to develop the product as well as maintain it. We obviously want to continue developing the product so that it's fit for purpose, not just for now, but for the future. And again, some of the roadmap which Scott's going to be talking about will touch on this. When we last did one of these, I put up a comparison of 2017, where we stood in the middle of 2017 and what we were forecasting for 2018. We were at that point forecasting to finish 2018 on about £400,000, and you'll have to excuse me putting this in pounds, not in dollars. And I'm pleased to say that we actually improved on that position quite significantly, and we continue to improve on that looking into 2019 with the first quarter just behind us now. The reason 2018 and the latter half of 2017 was so fruitful is largely thanks to the membership growth that's come predominantly from US institutions. So if we're joined by anyone today who has joined the consortium over the last 18 months, my sincere thanks to you. Every contribution to the consortium really is gratefully received and helps us, it gets us a long way. So our intentions with our stronger financial footing remain the same really as where we were building from in 2017. As I mentioned, we've got 2 new developers in the team now, and we would like to increase that development effort. I don't necessarily mean increasing the number of people, but being able to increase the amount of time that those people have available to the consortium and the Shibboleth project. We'd like to be able to respond more to community requests. And part of today's exercise is to try and gather some feedback from you as users of the software, and to see how we can push the strategic direction of Shibboleth as a product. One example of being able to respond to community requests is the extension to our OIDC in the Shibboleth IDP. And lastly, we want to make sure that we continue to ship quality releases in good timescales. We've got IDP v4 on the way, with Scott talking more about that, and leading into a v5 as well on an improved release timescale. In terms of where we are consortium membership wise, as I mentioned, we have grown significantly over the last couple of years. We've hit the 50 mark, which was just at the end of 2018, and we've now got 56. What we have seen over the last 18 months or so is a real growth in terms of the academic institutions joining, and a plateau of identity federations joining. Obviously, there are a lot more institutions in the world than there are identity federations, so this is to be expected in some manners. The other thing that's worth noting is that we still have a very low amount of commercial members. Commercial organizations still tend to shy away from contributing to open source projects, and this is something that we'd really like to be able to tackle, and any feedback on engagement with commercials is always appreciated. If we're joined by anyone today who's not already a member, some of the benefits that you get are knowing that you're contributing directly to maintaining the software. You're able to get support from the core development team. This was really what spurred the growth in membership from the middle of 2017, was a change in the direction of support model, by which members of the consortium are entitled to support from the core development team, and non-members are directed towards the community user mailing list. And you also get to contribute to the strategic direction of Shibboleth. Anyone who joins as a principal member, and there is a higher cost associated with that, gets a direct seat on the consortium board. The board meets once a month to discuss the direction. But every single member of the consortium has a voice. There are 2 board members who are representatives of the membership at large, and they can always be contacted. I'm always open to hearing from members, any feedback or ideas that you would like raised to the board, or anything that's posted to the members' mailing list or the users' mailing list. from a member will be raised to the board. So one of the key benefits is really being able to put in your own ideas and thoughts into the direction of the software. For anyone who is interested in joining, we've kept the membership fees the same since the last increase at the start of 2017. The row that most of you are going to be interested in looking at here is the middle one, the academic or non-profit member. We have a fair spread of institutions at the small, medium and large tier. There's a little bit more information on the shibboleth.net website about how those tiers are put together, and I'm also happy to discuss with anyone where an institution would fall if you are interested in joining. I mentioned earlier that anyone can become a principal member. That incurs an additional fee, which is quite significant, but does entitle that organisation to an automatic seat on the board. Membership fees, or membership period rather, is 12 months, and there's absolutely no obligation to renew the membership, although obviously we're very pleased when people do renew. We've also recently introduced a new tier of membership aimed at institutions with multiple campuses that share a Shibboleth system. So this is our multi-site level. Again, it's a significantly higher fee than an individual campus joining, and this is really aimed at institutions that have more than 5 campuses. The reason for this being it's less of an administrative burden. Obviously for the consortium it brings in a significantly higher amount, which is great for us, and it also means that everyone across any number of campuses would have access to the support from the development team. So we've currently got one member at that level, and we'd hope to see a few more. If you're interested in joining, it's very simple. You can email myself, and these slides will be shared after the webinar, I believe. So anyone who's not encountered my email address before, here it is, or quite simply get in touch at contact@shibboleth.net. What we'll do first is establish the correct membership tier for you. We then have a very simple membership agreement. There are a handful of terms which we ask folks to sign up to, but we're quite flexible as to some of those. So please don't be put off by the terms of the membership agreement. You can pull a copy off of this off of the Shibboleth website if you like, or I can send you one. The next step is that JISC, being the consortium operator, raise you an invoice. And I'm very pleased to say that JISC have finally updated their financial system and can raise invoices in US dollars now. And from there, we get you set up with the relevant mailing list and access to the support channels, and you're all set. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Scott. I believe we've got some time at the end for questions, but please do post any questions in the chat window and we'll make sure we get to them. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. All right, go ahead to the next slide. So first, before I get into what's coming, I wanted to sort of give a quick highlight of summary of the highlights of 2018, what we spent the last year doing, some of which was certainly related to the expanded funding that we had. 3.4, the IDP 3.4 release came out last year. This is expected to be the final release of the v3 code branch. We've since branched and master development has moved up to the v4 development line, so we're essentially in maintenance mode. We added a lot of warnings related to all of the things that we had already been scheduling for removal, and in a few cases we're still in the process of doing that. It's a pretty big code base at this point, so that was a surprisingly difficult thing to actually get systematically dealt with, more than one might think. We spent a lot of effort working back and forth with Unicon and folks that were involved in the tier effort to develop a way to drive a lot more of the feature set at runtime through metadata. Metadata has always been core to what we do in the product, but we wanted to kind of take it a layer deeper and start to work through how to use metadata in a much more comprehensive way to influence more of the behavior of the software. And that was something that enabled us to facilitate the work going on and in what was at that time tier, to work on a graphical user interface, to manage some of the behavior of the IDP, and do that in a way that didn't overly couple what we were doing as a project with the development of the GUI, which we weren't really in a great position to try to tightly bind ourselves to at that point in the development cycle. So that was a focus of this release. It's certainly a work in progress, but it's proven to be quite powerful. I've started taking advantage of it in some limited fashions myself. It isn't directly something that you need to use the GUI to make use of. It's a core feature in its own right. And in my particular case, it's been something that's helped me manage the key rollover process that I've been engaged in. And then lastly, there was a whole raft of improvements that we made to the dynamic metadata support. This is the just-in-time metadata model that we've been in the process of trying to move all the federations to that are currently relying on those large batches, which, as we all know, are getting to be a bit too large to manage effectively in terms of performance. A lot of those improvements came in direct response to feedback that took place a couple of years ago from an in-common working group that was formed to analyze requirements around what a dynamic metadata service would look like. And so we did a gap fit analysis of what was then planned or in place in the software stack, and we're able to use that to drive a lot of new development work to extend the feature set and make things a lot more flexible and deal with some of the reliability concerns that would come about from the new metadata model. So that was another core piece of that release. Go ahead to the next slide. The 3.0 SP was the other major work product of last year. That was the first major upgrade that we've done on the SP in a long time. It had been relatively frozen in place during the course of the V3 IDP development process. So we had to kind of reopen that code base for development for the first time in a while. The primary motivation for doing that was OpenSSL 1.1 compatibility, which, if you're not aware, is a version that is going to rapidly replace all the older versions and has a bit of an API shift to it. And so in order to be compatible with a lot of newer operating systems, we needed to update the code base pretty substantially to gain that compatibility. That reached down in the stack below the code that we're directly even responsible for. It included changes to some of the libraries that we depend on, which we had to do work on. So it was a pretty substantial effort. One of my co-developers actually did most of that work, as it turns out. We did not hit the timelines that we had hoped to hit in a lot of cases, and that's created some challenges for us dealing with some of the operating systems that moved more rapidly to adopt OpenSSL 1.1, Debian and Ubuntu in particular. So we're really just now in the process of trying to figure out how to get the packaging on those platforms appropriately refreshed and try to hit some of their upcoming releases to make sure that we have the right version of the SP in those operating systems. We were able to do some other work on this during this upgrade, and that included a pretty substantial rewrite of our IIS support. That's been a huge positive, not only because it's much more secure in its current form, it's also much easier to install and configure. It's much more automated to get the installer to install and uninstall it. It's much less work to deal with. It's much less brittle than the old design was. So given that all the versions of Windows that we currently support essentially are on IIS 7 or later, we've essentially all but frozen any maintenance on the older module, and we would expect to see that die off at some point in the future, though we don't have any timeline for that at this point. There were a few other improvements. One of the things that we did do was also make additional changes to the metadata support in the SP to bring it functionally alongside or on par with some of the changes that we made to the IDP. So there was essentially a rewrite of that entire piece of the code base. The dynamic metadata support that we had in the older 2X releases were more experimental than anything else, so they needed a fair bit of work to update. There's also a bit more streamlined support for virtual hosting scenarios in the SP. It's possible to do some things involving automatic generation of separate entity IDs for a large number of virtual hosts for scenarios where metadata is being scripted and a lot of it is otherwise automated. It's possible to keep the SP configuration itself extremely minimal to support that use case, much more so than it has been in the past. So that's another example of an improvement that we made. Next slide. So looking forward ahead from 2018, when we set about looking at the plan going forward for the next couple of years, there were a number of things that we based that plan on. One of them was obviously the improved financial stability that we had, which leads directly into the ability to get some additional resources, both in the form of expanding hours for some of the people that we had, but also adding a couple of additional developers, which gives us more agility in terms of parallelism. We can more easily work on multiple things at the same time, and they can kind of proceed at their own pace to some extent, instead of all being single threaded through a single group of 2 or 3 people to do all the work. We were able to base a lot of our forward planning around what we saw as a fairly successful rollout and adoption of the V3 IDP. We feel like the design of that has proven to be pretty sound in terms of stability, reliability, maintainability, enhanceability, all of the things that we were hoping to achieve, we were pretty comfortable with. And so I think we had the sense that we had the foundation now that we could begin to build on instead of having to go back and revisit a lot of core decisions. So that was something that we needed to kind of prove out for ourselves to make that decision. We have a fair amount of technical debt because of the long development cycle that V3 took because of the loss of one of the original developers early on, and which set us back about a year or so. That meant that some of the decisions that we had to make technically at that time were not necessarily ideal from a timing point of view. And one of those was the fact that we essentially had to base that code base on Java 7, even though by the time we ended up shipping V3, I think Java 8 had already come out at that point. So we have a fair amount of technical debt that we've accrued from some of the timing of the development cycles that we have to pay back, and that led into some of our decision making. And we also recognized that there was a desire to increase our release frequency and ideally regularity, provided that we could maintain a reasonable adoption curve, by which I mean that we don't want to put out a ton of new releases that people can't adopt effectively because of the upgrade time and complexity. So we have to be conscious of that if we're going to increase the release frequency, but at the same time, we also want to respond to that desire to see a faster development cycle from the project. So we have to balance those 2 considerations. The roadmap on the SP side, and I'll start there just because it's a simpler story. We largely consider that a fairly mature product at this point. We have dealt with what we see as the most viable platforms that we can support with that code base. That's not to say that there aren't other things that people want, but the code base that we have is designed around a certain kind of deployment model and a certain kind of development model that does not support a lot of platforms that people would like to see us cover. And so there's only so much that we can do in a lot of cases. But when we look at some of the other things that we don't support, one of them, Nginx, comes to mind. They don't have a model that allows us to do third-party development of a plugin that we can build and package ourselves, because they simply do not have the dynamic loadable module support and ABI stability that a product like Apache has, or even that IIS has. And so it simply isn't possible to plug into certain kinds of platforms the way that you can with the ones that we do support. So we've looked at some of the other ones that we might consider, and right now we haven't really identified anything jumping out at us that's actually practical. And so that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for additional enhancement that we haven't already taken on. Certainly if Apache or IIS moves in a different direction, we would have to revisit that decision and probably look at what we would need to do to maintain our support for those environments. We do have a lot of time that we have to spend on maintenance and on library compatibility issues, and that's where most of our time is spent on the SP at this point. And that really is unpredictable. It really just depends on what kinds of issues come up in different cases. We have to keep an eye on what OpenSSL is doing. We have to keep an eye on the viability of some of our other dependencies, not all of which are in great shape, and focus on limiting our security exposure as much as possible where we can. We did a fair amount of that work with SPv3 to try and control some of the attack surface a bit better than we've done in the past. And that's already borne some fruit, although we've had our own share of issues, even in light of some of those changes. The other thing I would highlight on the SP side is the packaging issue. These are ongoing conversations, so I don't have a lot to share right this second, but We do want to do a better job of reaching out and fostering relationships with all of the volunteers in the world that are doing various kinds of packaging of the SP software on different platforms that we don't directly support. We've always maintained some pretty good relationships in that regard, but we want to do a little bit more outreach there where we can to make sure that those people have the right information when they need it as early as possible to keep things as smooth as possible. We also want to come up with a better story to the membership that we can support them in certain cases when we know that there's a good stable packaging story. Debian is a good example of that. It's not a question of us needing to support that packaging. It's just that we want to make sure that we know that if we commit to supporting Debian, that that packaging story has a long-term sustainability story around it. So there's some conversations that we're going to continue to have both internally and outwardly focused to understand what we can do to make that happen. But I think it's likely that we will do some official statements to the membership about certain platforms, Debian certainly being one of them, that we would adopt as sort of official quasi-supported platforms, even though we're not handling the packaging for them. So that's something to keep an eye on. And we'll probably be going out with a bit of a poll of some kind in the future to try to get some information back from the membership about exactly which platforms they have the most concerns about and the most demand for to make sure that we can prioritize our activity where we need to. Next slide. So the IDP is where the most of the focus of our development work is. That's been true for a while, and it certainly is true going forward. Our current plan is to have two smaller than in the past, at least, major releases that are being allocated with roughly 12-month development schedules. We're not trying to hit a particular calendar day, but we're scoping the work based on the idea that we would try to spend no more than a year or so on each one, and we're already actively underway in about a quarter of the way through the development cycle for V4. The intention for V4 is to focus on removing a lot of legacy features from V2. This is the first time we'll really be removing a lot of stuff that we've been supporting, as opposed to just making gratuitous changes to V4. We're being pretty deliberate about what we remove and focusing on things that date back to the V2 timeframe. We expect that release will be mostly compatible with the current V3 environment. We don't expect to see a lot of breaking changes there, other than for people that have fairly advanced extensions that rely on a lot of internal APIs of the system. There are some public API changes that are undoubtedly going to get made, but they're not things that affect most deployers in practice. They would be things that would affect people that work on real meaty extensions of various sorts. And then the intention is for V5 would come relatively quickly after V4, certainly quicker than we have in the past. And the intention is so that we can make API changes again in order to finalize some of the newer features that might get added to V4. So we don't want to commit to a design in V4 for certain features and then find out that we've made the wrong decisions or not accounted for something. We want to give ourselves the wiggle room. API changes again where we need to support some of those features. So that's one of the reasons why we've already been planning on moving in the direction of a faster major release cycle because of the way our API versioning works. And I see a question about Java, by the way, and there's some answers about that coming on one of the slides. So I'll hold off answering that for a second. Next slide, please. In fact, it is the next slide. So our situation with Java is quite simply, we consider ourselves to be an enterprise product, not an agile one. That's not a pejorative statement. That's just a concrete statement of how we view ourselves and where we think we belong on the Java roadmap and the Java development cycle. Regardless of whether I agree or disagree with the way that Java is moving, it is what it is. So we've had to be pretty proactive about understanding how that's going to impact us, and we've been spending a fair amount of resources on that question. But what that means pragmatically is that for us, the Java LTS releases are the focus of our support activities and the focus of our planning process, not the ability to support every version of Java that comes along in the interim cycles. So right now, the LTS release is Java 11. Java 8 is almost on the verge of reaching its end of life state from Oracle's perspective. It will continue to be supported by at least Red Hat, because Red Hat has taken over as the maintainer for the OpenJDK 8 project, and they have plans to support it on at least some of their platforms through, I can't remember the exact year, but I think it's 2023 or 2024 or something like that. It goes out pretty far. But in terms of what we're focusing on, 11 is the current LTS release. And so our focus is on making sure that both the current code bases and also the future code runs under the appropriate LTS releases of Java. As such, V3 is officially supported under both 8 and 11. And as I'll get to in a second, we're targeting 11 for the V4 and future IDP code bases. What we're doing in terms of continuous integration testing is testing both the LTS release and whatever the latest Java release is that is officially available. We typically will start doing CI builds once the GA release is close. So we don't wait until it's out, but we will essentially wait to move forward for the final feature set to crystallize. So when 12 hit its no more changes period before it went GA. That's when we started doing testing of 12 in our CI environment. And once 13 reaches that state, we're going to drop 12 and essentially move our testing forward to 13 and so on and so forth. But meanwhile, we continue to do coverage testing of the actual LTS release, which is 11. LTS stands for long-term support, by the way, if that wasn't clear. That's what the acronym refers to. So when I say officially supported Java builds, I still can't give you an answer what that means. All this would be a lot clearer if we knew what officially supported meant. What I can say is that we're almost certainly not going to be spending a whole lot of time worrying about Oracle's commercial Java release for the simple reason that we don't expect a whole lot of people to adopt it. We would certainly change that if we got a lot of feedback from people that they are going to pay Oracle to run their Java, in which case we probably would take advantage of the fact that you can run it for development and testing purposes for free. So it's not that we have to pay Oracle to test it, but it isn't worth our time to worry about it if people aren't going to be running it. So that's something that we'll probably have to wait for some feedback on. But what it does mean is that our focus right now is probably going to be on various variants of OpenJDK as the primary Java that we're going to test. But aside from the window that Oracle provides a build of OpenJDK themselves, we don't yet have a firm answer about exactly which versions of OpenJDK we're planning to officially support going forward, and that will in turn obviously drive what we focus our CI testing on. Once we make those decisions. Certainly we are seriously evaluating Red Hat as an option. That's primarily because Red Hat has up until now been the most, they've been the one that has taken over the OpenJDK releases and been responsible for doing backports for the versions that have gone out of support. And there's not a whole lot of reason to believe they're not going to do the same thing with 11. They haven't officially assumed that role yet, because Oracle is still supporting it, but it seems pretty likely that that's what's going to happen. And the problem that we have is that both Red Hat and Amazon, which produce these OpenJDK builds, they have routinely applied fixes of their own, making their own decisions about exactly which fixes to pull back from future versions of OpenJDK. And they've done it in ways that make it very difficult to know exactly what version of Java somebody might have and exactly what the behavior of that version of Java is going to be on any particular platform. So it's becoming much more likely that for us, Java support is going to have to be platform specific, because it's the only way that we can actually baseline exactly what the behavior of the JVM is in any particular case. Because if we decide to commit to Red Hat's version of Java, that applies only to the platforms that Red Hat ships their version of Java on, which effectively is Red Hat, CentOS, and Windows, because that's what we would be able to actually evaluate from a testing standpoint. We can't just assume that the same exact Java build is what Amazon is supplying on some other platform that they're supporting. And that's the challenge that we have. So we're still not at the point yet where we've made those decisions, because the rest of the world is kind of waiting and seeing exactly who picks up what versions. And we're still waiting to see if there is another source that might step up to do something that's what I'll call a cleaner Java, cleaner OpenJDK distribution. What we really like is somebody to simply ship Java and not screw with it. But unfortunately, there isn't anybody yet that has clearly committed to doing that, because both Red Hat and Amazon have applied fixes that are different from each other to their versions of OpenJDK. And that's the problem that we're stuck with. So I don't think that answers the question, but it at least tells you what we're looking at and what we're seeing. And in terms of the Java versions, I think it should give a clearer story of exactly which Java versions you ought to be looking at in terms of adoption to run the IDP under. Next slide, please. So in terms of our roadmap for V4, we do have a link there to the wiki. We have a bit of a rough planning document that is not very readable, but it's the closest thing we have to a formal planning document for V4. It's really just a staging area for things as we move them into Jira and formally tag them with the right version, so that they're actually tracked as a work item for the next release. So there's a lot of stuff about what's being removed and what's being added, and we have not yet opened a documentation site for V4, which is essentially a clone of the V3 site, but we already have that built, and we're starting to make changes to it as we make other changes. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to be targeting Java 11 with this release. We're also moving to Spring 5. For the distributions on which for the Windows package that we actually ship a version of Jetty in, we're going to be moving that to Jetty 9.4, which is the current version of Jetty. It's the version that's most appropriate to run under the Java 11 platform, although Java 9.3 does, I believe, run under it. So that's our plan. The most significant things that we're removing are enumerated on that slide. I won't go through them just in the interest of time, but they give you a sense of some of the things that we are almost certainly going to be pulling from the code base. You can certainly ask about them on the list if there's anything there that's not clear. Pretty much all of that stuff is pretty clearly warned on right now in 3.4, so none of it's news. There are other things that we're evaluating for possible removal, so that's just the most significant stuff. And we're in the process of continuing to make some of those decisions. So next slide, please. The new work that we're looking at for V4, the most interesting piece for most people is that we're starting work on inbound, what I'll call inbound proxying, which is essentially the ability to do login to the IDP based on other single sign-on protocols. We're absolutely going to do that with OIDC as a starting point, because it gives us the ability to exercise the design work more when we're going from a protocol that we don't officially support outbound yet. In the case of OIDC, we have to map between OIDC and SAML or CAS, and so the ability to do that will help us prove out more of our design choices by doing that. But we're probably going to do something with SAML, whether in this release, if it slips, it slips. But if we do something, it's going to be more minimal than a full-featured SP design would be. It will probably be something that's targeted more at single IDP use cases. It may be something that we just pull in from a third-party project that's using OpenSAML. There's a pretty popular implementation for Java called Pack4J that's based on an updated version of OpenSAML. So it's possible that we would do that, and that's a single IDP design, from their point of view. So it wouldn't be a full-featured approach, but it would at least get us the ability to get our feet wet. So that's a big focus of what we're doing right now in V4. To support that use case, we're in the process right now of redesigning a lot of the attribute mapping features in the system, because we want to try to streamline the ability to process and map data between those protocols. So we want to be able to take data coming in from OIDC and output it in SAML and vice versa. And so we need to do that in a different way than we've historically done that sort of thing in SAML. So that's requiring a bit of redesign work, and that's one of the major things that we're doing in V4 in terms of new design work. Next slide, please. We have a few, I'll call them small logout enhancements. I mean, they're significant in terms of technical work, but they're not all that significant to most deployers. There's some work on SOAP logout that we haven't historically supported. That work is already done and working. We have a fair number of UI enhancements with possibly more coming that essentially provide for more variability in the user experience. There's the ability to do more prompting of the user if that's something that you want to do to decide how the logout should proceed, or to essentially bypass some of the logout behaviors. So some of that's more tunable with properties now to create a different logout experience with the same core user interface. And that work is also largely done. We're evaluating future replacement of velocity for a lot of the view templates that we have. That's because of a decision that Spring made to drop support for velocity. We have that support backported. We can continue to maintain it for compatibility, so it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But the actual Spring reference implementation for a template view language is FreeMarker, which is pretty similar to velocity, but not exactly the same. So we have a work task to evaluate that and decide if we really think that replacement of velocity is warranted from a maintenance point of view, or if we want to just introduce it as an additional option, or how we want to deal with that. So that's something that we're looking at. There's a lot of other miscellaneous stuff. I would point people to Jira to really dig into some of the things that we're going to do for this release, but they tend to be more a grab bag of the usual sorts of miscellany, so not something that's really appropriate to go through on a slide. Next slide, please. I will speak to OIDC specifically, since I know that's a topic of interest to a lot of people. The 1.0 release of the extension for v3.4, which came out of a Géant-funded project team, that is available now. It was announced in its 1.0 form a couple of weeks ago. They are planning to go through certification testing either this month or next to go through the OIDC certification testing. So they've been doing that through the life of the project. They've been doing testing against that suite, but they want to get the official certification brand. So that's coming. We absolutely plan, based on everything that we can see right now going forward, we don't see any impediments to adopting that extension into the IDP in a future release. We have an ongoing relationship now. One of the new developers that we've added is one of the people that worked on that code base. And obviously that's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring him into the fold. The timing for that incorporation is really going to depend on feedback that we get from people testing the extension, and the various schedule issues and workload issues that we run into with some of the principal developers that would need to do that work, which is not primarily myself. So it really depends on other people to some degree. So at this point, I think that the latest it would show up is v5, but I can't say for certain that it will or won't show up in v4, which obviously we're trying to ship at the end of this year, so we don't have a whole lot of time to do that. Whenever it happens, it's likely that there will be some configuration changes necessary, because obviously it was done as a third-party extension, and we may decide that we want to make certain adjustments when we pull the code in. But we're certainly hopeful that it would not be extensive, and we would take that into consideration with any of the decisions that we make. But we obviously can't commit to 100% compatibility. So that's what we're looking at in terms of our planning process for it. There's still a lot more to think about and do there, but that's kind of our current thought process around that. Next slide. The thing I will say about OAuth more generally, in terms of a roadmap issue, is that while I would say it's likely that there will be other profiles besides just OpenID Connect that we would support, but we would base those decisions on the chance of seeing real significant interoperability in whatever we did. So one of the things I know that we would be likely to support in the medium term, if not even in perhaps the first release of the OIDC code extension by us, would be the AppAuth model that Google has for mobile authentication. That isn't precisely OpenID Connect, so it probably will take some slightly additional work to support, but it's something that at least based on what I know, it's still a significant, potentially interoperable basis that a lot of people are going to be building solutions on. So it's something that we would probably want to support. More generalized support for OAuth is really going to depend on feedback and a lot more experience with what's really necessary to build and what's really useful to people. We don't really have a goal of becoming the world's best generalized OAuth platform. There's a lot of solutions out there in this space. There's a lot of different things that people are playing with to support that kind of use case. I know at Ohio State, we're starting to do a fair amount of work with the Amazon Cognito gateway, which is something that's part of Amazon Web Services. So we'll probably, see that may well motivate some of the things that we look at pulling back into the IDP, because we might have some significant feedback about exactly what's useful and not useful. So that's what I would say about the more general OAuth story. And I think that may be the last slide. Yep. So that's pretty much the extent of my roadmap talk. Happy to open the floor to questions. I see there's one in the chat right now related to Office 365. I can't say that I personally know a lot about the Office 365 ins and outs, other than I know a lot of sites are using it, and that I don't believe that there are too many cases involving Office 365 that actually technically require ADFS. I think that in most cases that's more of a tactical decision. I know in our case it had to do with what system my Shibboleth IDP talks to for authentication versus the site versus the way that we handled our mail accounts. And so there was no real practical way to marry those two for us in that timeline. I think you tend to run into that problem more than you run into actual technical constraints. I will say that I would guess that the native mail client support, proxy support that they have for WS Trust going to ADFS, I would have no doubt that that is more well managed by Microsoft than the ECP proxying variant that they use that happens to be supported by Shibboleth. But that's me speculating more so than anything else. I mean, I've certainly seen people talk about the ECP stuff being broken at times, but I can't say that I have any specific knowledge of how stable it's actually been, or whether there are other options for ADFS or any more stable, but they're both the same thing. They're just a giant mail proxy run by Microsoft. So, so I don't personally know of other use cases that require ADFS. That doesn't mean Microsoft support people understand that that's the case, or that they would tell people that. Of course, actually getting the information out of them tends to be like pulling teeth. I think that there are some older versions of Office that didn't support the advanced authentication stuff. But whether those actually worked with ADFS or not, I don't know. If that stuff worked with ADFS by way of some proxying trick that they used, then that would be an example of something that perhaps ADFS supported specifically and Shibboleth didn't. I would say regarding Azure MFA support, if that's something people would see as valuable, I don't think that there would be any necessarily inhibiting reason that would prevent us from supporting it. We actually had a conversation with the board earlier today about the general question of how we would effectively be able to support certain things that are essentially commercial. So something like Azure MFA probably would require some degree of access to Azure to support and to do appropriate unit testing against. With Duo, that's something that you can do with the free version of Duo that you can get as a personal individual. You don't have to pay Duo to get their service to be able to do anything with it. And that's not the case with AWS. I don't know that it is or isn't the case with Azure, but that's a consideration that we have to start working through. So I think strategically we recognize that we're going to have to answer some of those questions and start to recognize that we'll have to make some investments potentially in getting access to some of these cloud platforms, even if that means paying money. So that's something that we would have to look at in some of the individual cases. But in general, there's no reason I think that we would see that as a non-starter. I think Azure MFA is an example of one where it would be sensible to support it because all of the token management issues are already dealt with by Azure. When we look at some of the other multi-factor options out there, and I would include WebAuthn in this discussion. The problem with things like WebAuthn or FIDO before it and U2F was that it doesn't solve the token registration and management problem. It's really easy to support the technical exchange to actually support it for authentication, but it doesn't support the actual token management side of things, which is the value add that you get from things like Duo and Azure. So for us to build that as a solution doesn't seem like a great investment in Shibboleth time, particularly if that's something that we could do as a community and see a more general purpose token management interface built for, let's say, WebAuthn, because that would work for lots of things beyond just Shibboleth. So it seems like that's a direction that we ought to look at as a community. And then, you know, as a Shibboleth matter, the ability to actually build the authentication piece for some of these other technologies becomes a much simpler story for us. But in terms of Azure specifically, what I can say is nobody has explicitly requested that of us. There's no JIRA ticket for it. There's no member that's raised that as a request, you know, to understand, you know, that it needs to be looked at for us as a prioritization task. So that's really what I could say about it.
So there was a comment about maybe some folks not being able to see the questions, but I think Scott contextualized them pretty well. The MFA question, I think, was pretty straightforward. The first one that Scott addressed was from Drew and asked, any sense of how many sites are using Shibboleth as the IDP for O365? Also, are there any known use cases where SAML app can only be served by ADFS as the IDP rather than SHIB 3.4? So just in case others aren't seeing the question, wanted to contextualize Scott's answer a little bit more.
Yeah, the chat says it's going to all panelists, so I'm not sure why they're not showing up. But also as a roadmap issue, what I can say is that we don't have anything on the roadmap specifically that's targeted at solving any particular problem we know about with Office 365. We made a conscious decision not to support WS Trust a while back because as far as we could see, it was something Microsoft had effectively moved off of for most purposes. You know, if we needed to support some minimalized version of it because their ECP support was garbage and we needed to do something different, that's probably something that we would take under consideration. But I've not seen anything that would lead me to believe that's the case. If I had to guess, I'd say either both of them work or neither of them work particularly well for the other mail clients. So at this point, there's nothing we have on our horizon. But if we, yeah, I see it as going to just panelists. Sure, I forgot I'm a panelist. So yeah, if there's something that people know about, I think we would certainly take it under advisement. We certainly recognize Office 365 as something people want to support. So if people know of something, we'll certainly want to know about it.
So we've got about 5 minutes left or so for additional questions. Are there any other questions from a nice sized group today? Svetlana, yes, the question here is, can I get the slides of this presentation? Earlier up in the chat window, I put a link to the IamOnline website. To recap, it's incommon.org/IamOnline, all one word. And there'll be both the slides and a recording. And you can find many past sessions of IamOnline. It's a really good resource. Has been a good resource over the years. I personally use it as a reference for refreshing my knowledge of a particular topic.
And before I turn it back over to Kevin, a quick tease, which I included in the development blog for this month, which if you're not aware, I do a blog, though that's probably overstating it, but I do a monthly update for the board that is mostly takes the form of a public update in a blog post to our development wiki. And in fact, I can get a link to that once I have a second and paste it into the chat. So those are posted monthly, and they're pretty good for keeping track of what we're doing if you're not aware of them. And as I teased in there, we do have some code that we'll be releasing pretty shortly in an unsupported as-is form that I did to support the use of Shibboleth through ECP with Amazon's Redshift database federated login option that they have, which is a really weird beast if you haven't looked at it. But it actually supports federated login via SAML for JDBC and ODBC clients. It works kinda. It's an interesting beast. As I say, we have some code coming on that, and we'll probably be doing some kind of a blog article in concert with Amazon to publicize that as well, since they gave us permission to get the code published and publicize that a bit. So that's a little bit of a tease as well. And if there are any other questions, I guess I'll turn it back over to Kevin to close things.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Justin. And Justin, appreciate you digging into your what must be your supper hour. Appreciate it. We have 2 training and workshop opportunities coming up. The Shibboleth installation workshop at UMBC on April 30th and May 1st. That's the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, in between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. will use the containerized version of Shibboleth that is part of the InCommon Trusted Access platform. We have a new event that we're really excited about. Basecamp is for those who want an introduction to identity management, the InCommon Federation, or the Trusted Access platform software, which includes Shibboleth, Grouper, CoManage, and Midpoint. I need to, unless Aaron beats me to the punch, put the link to the webinar survey. See if Aaron can get to that while I'm finishing the outro here. There's a survey that we ask you to fill out. It's really good feedback for us to design continue to tweak the format of the series and ideas that you might have for future content as well. So please take a couple of minutes to complete that evaluation. As it appears on your screen, we'll certainly keep the channel open until the top of the hour to make sure it gets there. And that's it for today. Thank you all for joining us.